I didn't really have an intro plan, so we're just jumping right into it. So at the top of the patch 2.5 week 2 tier list, we still have the Zoe Ionia decks. Lee Sin and Karma still doing very well for themselves. Opening weekend, Lee Sin came out swinging, taking about half of the top cut of the online link series, the other half being taken by triple aggro. Not as much Zoe Karma as I would have expected, but I do still think that the deck is well positioned into the meta that we're in, especially if you want to run that instead of Lee Sin, or run it to beat Lee Sin, because there are lineups that can out late game the Lee Sin, especially with Aurelion Sol making a big comeback after the nerfs on Aphelios, so that's something we're going to have to watch out for, but for the most part, players aren't going for that style of play. It's mostly triple aggro or some kind of Lissandra Lee Sin X lineup, so we'll have to keep track of how that plays out over the course of the weekend. Of course, Watcher Control still absolutely everywhere, very good deck. It's not going anywhere. Asol Demacia. Last week I had thought that it was going to be Grand Plaza Targon because that's what we saw before Aphelios dropped, and with the Aphelios Temple nerfs, kind of revert back to what we were going to see before that. But instead, Asol Demacia is sort of like, let me actually show you the list because I can do that. So as you can see, it's more of that like pseudo-dragon mid-range style with Dragon Guard's lieutenants and things like that. And I went over in War Room about the kind of matchups that this has against the aggro decks of the format. They are, for the most part, if they're expecting a lot of aggro, they'll double up on the Sunforger and the Fangs, so playing both copies of those, then having your single combats to ensure that the lifesteal goes off and your opponent can't dodge you with a cheeky Noxian Fervor or anything along those lines. So this is what those decks look like. They're still running Judgment pretty much across the board. Star Shaping as a one-of is a little bit weird, but, you know, maybe we'll see that go up. This is just kind of a sample list. I don't remember if I grabbed this from any particular players, so just kind of take this shell and adjust as needed. Like, I don't think 3 Hush is standard. I had to have grabbed this from someone because I don't think I would have built it like this, but you know, you can kind of mix and match with the numbers as you want to, and just understand that your general strategy is these 2 lifesteal units let you beat aggro, and then Aurelion Sol carries you against the late game decks. And it's been a pretty popular choice among a lot of players. Probably the most popular Demacia deck, with Scouts also kind of contesting it for that spot. But let's talk about Nightfall aggro. So Nightfall and Scouts, I kind of went over in War Room, are sort of the mid-range aggro decks of the format, meaning that they play aggressively against decks that lose to aggro, and they get to play a little bit more of a late game or mid-game style against aggro decks. And I think that they're just well positioned against pretty much everything in the meta. The problems that they're going to run into are their own inherent inconsistencies, as well as sometimes you just don't draw the right hand for the right matchup. So, you know, if you can beat everything, it doesn't mean you're going to beat everything. If you draw the aggro hand against a deck where aggro doesn't work, then, you know, you're going to fall into that kind of pitfall. But Nightfall, you know, just getting the most consistent Unto Dusk value, and Unto Dusk Doombeast has really come up as one of the more popular meta choices in the format. Even outside of Nightfall, we've seen Spiders go for it, we've seen Slay aggro go for it, and I think that Nightfall is just the one that is most consistently getting the value out of that, is getting the most consistent Doombeast procs, so it's kind of why Nightfall gets to stay at the top. Scouts, you know, similar thing. You play aggro against the aggro, or against the things that lose to aggro, all that kind of stuff. And Scouts, for the most part, has been a really popular Demacia deck as well. Now, one thing that I do want to touch on is that while Stony Suppressor Scouts is still the most popular version, with so much triple aggro popping up, I don't know how long that's going to last. It's very possible that players start to cut the Stony Suppressor and just take the Scouts in a more aggressive route against things like Lee Sin, or just say, hey, you know, I'm not seeing as much Lee Sin as I thought I was going to, so these Stony Suppressors really aren't doing as much, because for the most part, you are running a lot more spells in your Scouts deck than any other aggro deck is, so it can actually start to play against you in a lot of matchups, and I just want players to be cognizant of that going forward. I think even in EU Fight Night, there are a couple players playing right now that just cut the Stony Suppressors entirely, so that's an adaptation to be on the lookout for. Not every Scout deck is going to have Stony in it, and it is very viable to run the deck without Stony. It's no longer in a position where I feel like it was in the TFIS format, where it is getting hard carried by that card, so you do have a little wiggle room in how you want to build out your Scouts list. So jumping down into Tier 2, we're going to lump together Spiders, Lucian Azir, Discard Aggro, and Pirate Aggro. Just kind of get over there. Those are sort of the 12 one-drop decks that I was talking about, even though Lucian Azir and Discard aren't really running 12 one-drops necessarily. But they're the low to the ground, go really fast, gas out, I lose if you just have too much healing. Like, something like Scouts, you actually have to kill. Same thing with Nightfall in a lot of cases. Something like Spiders, you don't have to kill them, you just have to run them out of cards and be at more than 10 HP, and all of a sudden the game is unwinnable for them. And that's where decks like Asol Demacia are doing really well. All it takes is like one good Sunforger single combat turn, and you have completely blown the Spiders player out of the water. They're left with very few cards in hand, you get rid of a lot of their board, and overall things just start to get a lot worse for them from there, especially if you can maintain another lifesteal unit like a Fangs or something along those lines. So that's kind of the style of play that these players are going for. If you're running a triple aggro lineup, I want to say that you should probably be including, at the very least, one of these, probably 2 of them. I mean, Scouts, Nightfall, and then something like Discard card, definitely not a bad lineup, but for the most part, a lot of players are doubling down on the 12 1-drop aggro, and you'll see spiders and pirates and like Nightfall pretty consistently among the same lineup. You know, with so much lifesteal being in the format, it's still nice to have Noxian Fervor available. Those are sort of the two big aggro spells at the moment. It's Noxian Fervor and it's Unto Dusk. So for the most part, it's not often that you're going to see an aggro deck without one of those two cards. Most of them are Noxus or Shadow Isle at this point. Something like Lucian Azir, even that is starting to go towards an Azir Darius Draven build, and we might even be seeing that pop up more than the Lucian Azir at this point. So just something to keep in mind. A lot of fervors running around. If you are playing against aggro, you know, your Grasp of the Undyings or your Solari Sunforgers might not be the most consistent lifesteal sort of avenue that you need them to be. So just keep that in mind when building your decks. Deep, sticking around in tier 2, nothing really new there. Players still figuring out the build paths for those. Burblefish pretty much looks exactly the same as it previously did, still doing well in tournaments. Draven Ezreal, still feel like this deck is underrepresented, and you guys know I don't like Draven Ezreal. I even tried playing this deck on ladder a little bit and was reminded very quickly why I don't play this deck. I think that in the past, I've liked Draven Swain more than I've liked Draven Ezreal, but I do think that the consistent Mystic Shot generation, even just clearing out Doom Beasts, is kind of important, because if your opponent is running Unto Dusk in whatever deck they're playing, you know, you want to get those Doom Beasts off the field before they can actually start to establish those combos, especially if they're running it in something non-Nightfall related like Spider aggro. Just give them that pseudo dead card later on. And yeah, I know it's still a draw, but in an aggro deck on turn 5, you do not want to be paying 2 mana to draw a card if you're not getting any additional benefit off of that. Starspring, I had this in tier 1 last week. The problem was I didn't see Mist Wraiths anywhere in the meta, and I said, hey, there's not a lot of Fearsome. And I really just kind of undervalued how much Fearsome is in both Spiders and Nightfall, and I think that Starspring, while it's still a viable meta choice, is struggling a little bit more than I thought it would, even against the 12 1-drop aggro. You know, sometimes you just get burned out before you can actually get everything online, and it's hard for Starspring to actually run those decks out of cards. It takes a long time when you're only, you know, throwing out one Tahm Kench spell a turn. You really need to assemble like a Boxtopus Soraka Tahm Kench combo to be able to deal with aggro, and that can be really difficult to do sometimes. So I still think that Starspring is powerful, but it is getting countered more organically than I thought it would, so that got shifted down to tier 2. Invoke is still hanging around. We saw Catasis go 6-0, or maybe even 7-0. I don't remember how many rounds we had in the online league series with a Boxtopus Aphelios Zoe straight out of last format. Unfortunately fell in top 8, but did have a really impressive Swiss run with that, and then finally got a better idea of what Atrocity Invoke looks like. Trickster Sorry actually won a tournament last night, I want to say Thursday night, with this list. So just going back to the Zoe Diana, I think I was trying too hard to fit Asol in here and make sure that it was Zoe Asol so that you could take it to the late game against other decks, and sort of just negating the fact that Atrocity is how you take things to the late game. And I think I was really just overvaluing the presence of something like Zoe Karma. So, you know, that's what happens when you're just analyzing things and not testing them. And Solari Shadestalker and the Mountain Goats, I think, are like pretty good additions to this deck, just going for a more low to the ground, meet the aggro down on their level, throw out a 2-drop when they throw out their 2-drop, and it's a really nice style of play, and I think that a deck like this can go pretty far. I'm just not sold on it being as powerful as I would like it to be, because it does look a lot more value oriented, and there are definitely decks in the format that are going to be able to outvalue it. And then I split up the Shen Demacias because I think that Shen Jarvan is a lot better than Shen Lulu, and I actually want to show you what these decks look like side by side so that you understand what I'm talking about. Not the cleanest graphic I've ever made in my life, but it gets the point across. Essentially, the difference is that Shen Jarvan looks a lot like Shen Fiora used to. A lot of players still going for, like, River Shaper, throwing in the Fleet Feather Tracker, not seeing as many copies of Greenglade Collector, but it's still not out of the question. Players are still really figuring out these lists and experimenting with them because they are relatively new. And then Shen Lulu was a much more low-to-the-ground, aggressive style of deck. Not really seeing Nopify out of either of these decks, which I think is fine. Nopify's not really in a great spot in the meta right now. It doesn't do a lot against Nightfall or Scouts. It does a little bit against the Fervor decks, but you kind of have to line it up perfectly. And overall, I think it's just more of a dead top deck more often than not. But the Lulu Shen kind of plays a lot more aggressively. As you can see here, the decks were topping out at 4 mana. They were playing 5 rally effects. And then something like the Shen Jarvan, I think that J3 and Brightsteel Formation were adding a lot to the late game of this deck, and overall I'm a bigger fan of the much more mid-range style of deck than this like weirdly aggressive, try to aggro you out and cheese you out with supporters. I just wasn't really a fan of the Lulu Shen, so that's why these actually have been split up, in Shen Jarvan I believe is tier 2, and Lulu Shen I believe is tier 3. I think that we're going to see a lot more players start to gravitate towards the Shen Jarvan specifically, and we have seen a couple of players, even in the LRA and LBR and maybe even some other tournaments, go go for a Shen Jarvan Lulu split, and when they do that, it tends to look more like the Shen Lulu with a Jarvan thrown in. And I think that, once again, I'm gonna live by, like, I'm just gonna keep pushing this philosophy of, if you see 3 champions in a deck, it's probably a pretty unfinished product. It's not often that we actually see 3 champion decks be the end result, see them win a tournament, or see them consistently stick around in the meta. So I think that players are just still kind of experimenting and figuring out what they want, and not everybody plays a tournament as the end game. Sometimes the tournament is testing for something like the seasonal, which I do believe that you should be using this as. So they throw together a hodgepodge deck and say, hey, I'm going to see which half of this feels better, and they can make a more informed decision for the main event, so to speak. And then starting off tier 3, we have Thresh Nasus, which I actually wanted to touch on here. So Trickster Sorry, won the Brazil Open Invitational last night. This is the Zoe Diana list that I had shown you a little bit earlier. He also played Thresh Nasus, and he played Draven Ezreal, as he had cited here, kind of going for an anti-aggro kind of lineup, and didn't do well against double Targon. And, I do think that double Targon is still something that we're going to be seeing a lot of. I think that for the most part, the Lee Sin lineups are going to be like Lee Sin, Lissandra, some kind of Targon deck, probably even Aesol Demacia. So I don't know. I feel like the Thresh Nasus deck has been missing something. I still feel like it's missing something. I'm not super familiar with its matchup charts. I could definitely see it having a pretty decent time against aggro, because it is one of the better Black Spear decks. You're going to be able to consistently remove everything that your opponent has, but I think that Sorry going and winning a tournament with this doesn't really change my ideals that Thresh Nasus just isn't doing super hot right now. And I also saw a stat that it was the most played deck in Europe Masters. I don't know if that was for a day or for a week. I want to say it was for a day. And it had a pretty decent win rate, but in tournaments, this deck just isn't getting it done. It's not doing well against the decks that players are consistently bringing, and I don't know that there are so many triple aggro lineups that you can get away with something like this, especially if, as Sorry had mentioned, it's not doing too well against double Targon. And that's just kind of the lineup player that Sorry is. We saw him win an OLS not too long ago with, Scarground. So this is a player that constantly brings off meta, and I don't think that players should read too much into the recent success of Thresh Nasus. Now, I could be wrong on that. That happens sometimes, right? Like, I'm not going to get everything right, but I think that Nasus Endure, the Thresh Nasus builds, are still a bit of a bait. And then rounding it out, we still have Overwhelm. As I had mentioned, I didn't think this deck was going to do super well once the meta shifted over. It was a pretty specific counter to the low HP units of the previous meta, like Burblefish Mind Meld, like Zoe Aphelios, and it's just not doing super well against the aggro decks that are still playing to that playstyle, because in a lot of hands, Overwhelm isn't going to start playing the game until turn 3, and your Omen Hawk isn't even an effective blocker against most of the things that are happening, because a lot of the one-drops are, we're talking Legion Saboteur, sure, you get a trade on that one, you don't get to trade onto Precious Pet, you don't get to trade onto Legion Rearguard. The Rearguard buff did a lot in helping things like Omen Hawk and other one-drops not being super effective blockers. Spacey Sketcher, another victim of this, so still think that Overwhelm is properly placed. Lulu Shen, I went over. Frostbite midrange just doesn't do good enough against aggro, and I don't think it does great against Lee Sin. I know that it's favored against Lee Sin, but I don't think it is so favored that you can consistently run this in a lineup. But once again, I just have to mention, tier 3 decks are still capable of winning tournaments. That's why they're on the tier list. If I didn't think these decks could be in a winning lineup, I wouldn't have them on here. Go Hard, I still think, is being figured out. I think that this is a deck that has a lot of potential to figure out a really clean build and actually make big waves at the seasonal tournament, but I'm not a deck builder, so I'm not the one to figure that out. I leave that to everybody else, but I definitely feel like the tools of Shadow Isle Bilgewater are still there and are still being tinkered with. Still not expecting anything from Go Hard this week, but it's definitely my deck to watch going into the seasonal. And then Frostbite Foundry got moved down to tier 3 because holy moly, do you not handle aggro well, and aggro is everywhere. And that's really it. So those are the updates to the tournament tier list. Now, don't forget to check back on Tuesday. That's right, Tuesdays for Tournament War Room, because we are still casting the LRA, and that takes us, cast Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So it's just a lot easier for me to get these things out on Tuesday, and that also gives me day 1 of the LBR and the LRA to look at and get you guys some additional data. And hey, who doesn't like additional data? Now, as for this weekend, as I had mentioned earlier, Duels of Shurima will be happening. That will be cast by myself and Jay Doza on his new Twitch channel, JDozaGG. It's not underscore, it is just JDozaGG, and I'll have a link to the sign up for Duels of Shurima down below, as well as a link to the tier list. It's in my link tree, where you can also find my other socials, like my YouTube that you're watching right now, and my Twitter from the BLVD. Thank you guys so much for watching. I wish you the best of luck this weekend, and don't forget to have a little bit of fun with it, and, just keep your eyes focused on the seasonal.